We've got locals first. So if you're watching this after we aired it on locals, just know that a lot of the stuff that we do, you get to see first over on locals, justinbarclay.com/locals. Free to become a member. There is a way to support and all that. You can get into all that if you'd like to, but we do a lot of the good stuff in there, free for members. Joining us today, Ian Murphy. He's going to talk a little bit about what's happening with the Iron Pig. I want to talk about the saga of the Iron Pig too. I want people to get the full story if they're not familiar. But Ian, welcome in, man. Really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. I appreciate you having me on today. It is a saga. I mean, it's a saga that when we set out to made the decision back in November, just before Thanksgiving, literally the day before Thanksgiving, 2020, we kept the Iron Pig here in Gaylord, downtown Gaylord. We kept it open against the emergency orders, and we always have to define the difference between executive orders, which were ruled unconstitutional, and then they turned to emergency orders 3 days later. And, we saw more devastating effects from the emergency orders than we did from the executive orders. And it was a whole crazy thing that I never thought would turn into what it is today. I never thought I would know as much about law and the Constitution more than I knew from civics classes, what limited civics classes I got in high school. But here we are, almost 3 years later, come this fall, and we've got a bunch of losses under our belt, but I always joke that we lost our way to the top, because the one that mattered was a January 2022 ruling from Judge Hunter right here in Otsego County that answered the question of constitutionality of the health law. And I try not to get too nerdy with this stuff. We always try to say we try and explain it to the guy on the other side of the bar. Well, 333.2253 was what the emergency orders was all based on. And it had this language in it that said the health director may limit the gathering of people for any purpose. And that's what they used to shut down restaurants, to limit gatherings, to, require you to stay within your pod for Thanksgiving, for crying out loud. You couldn't have more than a dozen people. I mean, there's a litany of things that we could go through that we were, curfews.
Yeah.
Curfews. We were required to be in our homes and not have the X amount of people. And I haven't even talked about the mask stuff or any of the wild vaccine stuff. I try not to get into any of that, because for us, it wasn't about that. It was about the choice. And we just wanted to give Justin the choice to come to the Iron Pig. If he felt, I just was on Twitter with somebody not a half an hour ago and said, listen, I understand you're upset about COVID, and we're not denying that COVID was deadly and any of this stuff. As a libertarian, I just believe that, you should be allowed and you have the right to make your own risk assessment, especially as an adult. And we kind of did that in the fall. I put out a Facebook post when they first closed restaurants down again. I said, hey, given the current environment, would you feel comfortable still eating out if it wasn't dining room closure? And a lot of people said yeah. And then a lot of people got really mad and said, well, it sounds like you're taking a survey of whether or not you're going to stay open. And we were closed at the time, November. And we went through a week of this stuff. And, the sign-in sheets had come out in October, which was devastating for business, because it really targeted restaurants as being this COVID vector. And it wasn't the same as the first shutdowns. I mean, we were no longer labeled the essential workers. The customers' attitudes had changed.
And they were creepy too. These sign-in sheets were really creepy. It was like almost you had to sort of tattletale on yourself, and all your information was out there, and then you could get contact traced. And
I knew it was weird when they had an anonymous tip line to basically narc people out, and not just restaurants. Average businesses, engineers. I mean, there's an ongoing MIOSHA case over in Alpena involving an engineer where MIOSHA came in under these same terms, and fined these people, just because somebody called and complained. I mean, you can see it's kind of like online reviews taken to the nth degree, except, Yelp is now the government that's going to come in and start to analyze every little bit of detail that you do. But I made the decision after seeing a week of just terrible businesses. We can't do this. And I didn't take COVID the first go around, PPP, COVID relief money, the first go around, because I just felt like it was a bailout. And I 2008, I saw what the bailouts from that, and I just fundamentally couldn't get on board with it. So I said, to heck with it. We're gonna stay open. I called the health department a day ahead and said, listen, you're painting me into a corner. And the very next day, I think November 24th, biggest bar night of the year, by the way, for all bars. And we couldn't have any dine-in. I said, listen, we're going to stay open. 11:30 the next morning, the health department was there with a cease and desist, which is actually now evidence in this.
How did you do that day? But by the way, like that night, did you have a big dine-in? Did you have a big number of people that came through, or?
We had a lot. Now, if I had known everything was going to go the way that it ended up going, I would be a marketing genius. But really, we kind of had no idea where it was going to go, except for a couple of restaurants in South Michigan, Wood Chips Barbecue, the Meeting Place in Fenton. A couple of places were out there a week ahead of us that had liquor licenses. So I kind of had an idea of what they might try to do. But not to the degree that they went with us. I had the longest liquor license suspension of any restaurant, 90 days in Michigan. A $600 fine is what they ultimately got me with. But we took that because the Liquor Commission, they came in and found me in violation of a crime, basically violating a law, and that law was 2253.
Yeah.
The Department of Agriculture ended up coming after me. A couple weeks before Marlena was put in jail, they threatened me at 10:30 at night with the same thing, saying, "Listen, you got to shut down." What's that?
Department of Agriculture.
Yeah, so it started with a health department order that was then enforced by the Liquor Commission, because they knew that licenses are a privilege to have, especially a liquor license, and they know that they are not easy to get. And that's the big hammer that they used over a lot of us. So when I didn't capitulate on that and I kept the restaurant open, then the Department of Agriculture, which issues my license through LARA, which is the licensing entity, and then it is monitored by the health department. So you can already see how this conglomerate of executive branch agencies is bearing pressure down, and that's really what this new declaratory action is about. But they just wanted to keep coming after me. MIOSHA sent me a letter saying we've received complaints, saying that your staff is not adhering to the COVID guidelines, yada, yada. And again, it was a choice. I gave them the choice. I didn't say you had to wear a mask. If you were going to wear a mask and wanted to, I would fully support that 100%. Just like every customer that came in the door that was wearing a mask, we didn't shame them. We didn't tell them to get out. None of that. It was the exact opposite. It was usually business as normal.
See, that's why I asked, though, is how did you do on that bar deck? Because imagine that, allowing people to make their own decisions. Where did the average person kind of fit in? And let them decide. And it said that you did well. I mean, there were enough people that wanted to come out. There were enough people that wanted to be there, that wanted to work, and you let everybody kind of make their own decisions on this.
Yeah.
Decide their own risks, where they're at. I mean, everybody's going to be different on everything. Just crazy to me how far off the rails we got on some of this stuff.
And it was such a crazy time that's why I asked that question on Facebook, a week before we stayed open. We have a relatively large platform for a restaurant in Northern Michigan, and I wanted to ask the question, who feels comfortable making their own decisions in this current environment? If a restaurant was still open, would you feel comfortable dining? And I just got lambasted for it. But the ultimate result was none of those people that were upset at me online, and my friends, to be honest, never came to the restaurant. Yeah. And the ultimate answer to your question is people showed up in droves, not just that night, but every day that we were open after that, because people understood what it was that we were doing, even though there was plenty of rhetoric out there, mainly given out by the mainstream media, if you will. You know, we have a couple of local news agencies up here and a newspaper, and they're really only interested in telling you, you know, what's going to get your attention for that 30 seconds, and they're going to tell you what a bad person I am. But as soon as we started winning, they had no interest in telling the entirety of the story and really understanding that this wasn't about COVID. It wasn't about masks. It was about government overreach and how they were already found in violation.
So they just kind of went quiet. It's almost like the story doesn't exist anymore. That's really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it opened my eyes up to kind of what narratives weren't being told. You can see daily which ones are, but which ones are being silenced. And that's kind of why I've started my own podcast for dozens of followers, as I like to joke. But we had to get our information out there, and it was, you know, incumbent upon you to consume that information or not. And I just believe that independent content creators, you know, like yourself, are out there telling a lot of these stories that these folks with a certain narrative to tell aren't very interested in it.
Yeah, they don't want you to know the truth, and they're not interested in that at all. And unfortunately, some of it's just the way the business is set up. Look, that they're dying. A lot of mainstream radio, television is dying. And what's exacerbating that and quickening it is the fact that they refuse to tell the truth and actually talk about things that people really care about. What they found themselves doing is stories that are clickbaity, you know, for lack of a better term. They just want the clicks. They want the easy, low-hanging fruit, the interaction, things like that, the sensationalized, the stuff that's going to, I could, you know, turn in for just a microsecond or whatever it might be. They're not interested in really serving the people. And I have this crazy thought that you need to know the good, the bad, and the ugly. Yeah. And if you can have all of the information, the best information, then you can make best decisions for you and your family. And that's just it. If they're going to tell us the truth, then we can make those risk assessments on whether or not I could go to the bar or not, or should go to the bar. Or, you know, maybe the bar wasn't the place that I was going to be. I don't know. But maybe it was. Maybe I did want to go and have dinner with my family that night. Who knows? But it's up to me to make that decision. And in order to be able to do that, kind of lay the cards out on the table. That's how it works.
Yeah. And again, nobody bothered to ask. Nobody bothered to come and ask and talk to my employees that we ended up keeping full-time. In fact, I ended up hiring more people. Wow. Nobody was interested in talking to them and understanding that they couldn't live on $340 a week or whatever unemployment maximum was. Forget about the money, the stimulus money that was given away. Nobody was interested in talking to me. I'm a type 1 diabetic. I sit in that category as predisposed to this thing that's going on. People don't ask and understand that my sister is an emergency room doctor here at the hospital 6 blocks away. Wow. And if she thought for one moment that I was ever doing anything to endanger her or our community, she'd slap the hell out of me. But nobody bothered to ask any of those questions. Wow. They just wanted to assume that, you know, I was this MAGA Trump guy. I was upset about the election and hate government. And this is the way that I'm going to show my displeasure, is by thumbing my nose, as I actually just did, at the establishment, which actually is what I did, but I did it through my legal due process. And that is really what, again, this case is all about. This new one is the separation of powers, and really what has happened, where the legislature is giving too much authority, delegating too much authority to the executive branch. And that's what happened with the EPGA that was ruled unconstitutional. That's what's happened with this health law now twice. and now in a published ruling that we've talked about a little bit. T&V Associates had a great ruling out of the Court of Appeals back in June, I think, that affirmed our win. So it gave us another stepping stone to be able to take this new lawsuit after all of the BS that we had gone through. And I'll tell you, when you ask the question about, did people show up and how was business, they did suspend our liquor license for 90 days. Yeah. And I've never sold more soda in our restaurant ever. And we couldn't keep the CO2 canisters filled here. Wow. People were showing up, buying T-shirts. We never did a GoFundMe. We never did a Give, Send, Go. We never did any of that. We sold T-shirts. We had a couple of rallies. One big one that we had in early January 2021 that over 350 people showed up here at another restaurant here in town, and a friend of mine hosted because I was shut down. Police showed up, did their thing, but oddly enough, he never received a complaint from the Liquor Commission.
Isn't that something?
So here we sit today. I personally served our local health department, and really what we're looking at is the local statute mirrors the state director's authority, almost word for word. Instead of state health director, it says local health director. And that number is MCL 333.2453. And again, the wording is almost exactly similar. And what's interesting about this entire thing is we're targeting 4 other ones, but they're all the same thing. It's all this ambiguous language, may reasonably, the language is so obscure. It's no wonder they took this limit the gathering of people for any purpose and used it to do all sorts of crazy things like curfews and sign-in sheets and all that stuff. Yeah. So we're targeting 4 more. But what's more important than that is in this declaratory action. Now, I try and remind people that this isn't a monetary lawsuit. This is what's called a declaratory complaint or action. And there's 168 paragraphs of all fact. There's no conjecture, nothing in there. It is a timeline virtually of how the government came after a little restaurant owner in northern Michigan and used all of these executive branch agencies to try and punish them for what is now an unconstitutional law. And it has to be looked at, how has this happened? And in the back of this, the very last count 5, I think it is, we discuss what's called the vesting clauses. And in Michigan's Constitution, I want to say it's Articles 4, 5, and 6, each lay out what each branch is vested with. We, the people, vest the power in the executive branch agencies to execute the laws. The legislature writes the laws, and the judicial branch interprets the laws. I mean, the language is almost that simple. Of course, I'm paraphrasing a bit, but this is what we say. So our case has been evolved around, and so was some others, this idea of non-delegation doctrine. There is a bit of permissible delegation of lawmaking ability to the executive branch. Our argument simply states there is no permissible delegation, that we, the people, have vested these powers in each of these branches, and those 3 articles and the separation of powers article, which is maybe 3, specifically vest those powers. It cannot be divested, which would exactly be what these other laws have done. So we are trying to set the precedents and introducing this argument of vesting clauses. So when we want to talk about the governor creating another executive branch agency, whether it's another education department or not, we can look at some of these things and say, listen, Myosha has way too much power, as we're going to see in a lawsuit out of Alpena, I believe. The school code has too much power. We've got 2 ongoing cases we're not involved with. My attorney is involved with Comstock and Kalamazoo, where they're looking at the language from the school code, which is just as ambiguous as we see here. So this is what we're looking at, is we're now going to start drilling down and saying, listen, These executive branch agencies have grown too big. They have too much power. When they are writing law and enforcing a law, that is the definition of tyranny. It is that simple. And that's what we saw with the health department. After the governor couldn't make executive orders anymore, 3 days later, they basically copy and pasted using the health law 2253 and 2243 and destroyed Michigan and Michigan businesses and families too, let's be honest, because inside the health law were mandates for nursing homes and some other thing. They ended up amending that in December after it was ruled unconstitutional. So I blame everybody. I'm not blaming one party or the other. I'm kind of blaming everybody in this one because they just haven't taken, and I don't know how it landed on a barbecue restaurant owner and his attorney that is not a constitutional law attorney. Somehow we figured these things out, and there are much smarter people than he and I around. So here we sit today with the complaint filed, and we're going to see what they have to say about these arguments we're making.
Ian Murphy with us, and the obviously the Iron Pig and Gaylord, but the fight continues. How do you think we got? You just mentioned it's kind of like everybody's fault. How do you think we got this far off track?
Well, boy, that is a real. How much time do we have? I think that it's an over reliance on government to make us feel safe. I always try and point out that we did stay closed during the first go around back in March of 2020. We didn't know what was going on. So we looked to our government and those officials that we thought had our best interests at heart and were giving us all of the information, not just a version of some of the information. But as things started to come out and more information starts rolling around, we're open, we're closed, we're open. Well, we can have 25%. Well, it's a curfew this week, so apparently COVID isn't an issue after 10 o'clock or whatever it is. It has fundamentally changed our business, but I think it originates from a trust in government that probably was misplaced. Now, we could have a discussion about how that trust has been torn down, but I think institutionally, through schools, public schools, I'm not trying to pick on public schools, but, going back to lack of civics, lack of debate, some of these other things have really torn down the fabric of how we're able to discuss things openly and honestly and have these discussions without the crazy virtue signaling that happens, the crazy emotion that comes around some of the topics. And I always say we have to remove the emotion from this stuff, and we have to look at how these laws are being applied. And were these the intent? This health law is from like 1976. Was this the intent of this health law when the legislature unconstitutionally, as it turns out, gave the health department this authority to do these things and some others? But it just really comes down to the ability to critically think and find your own information about what's going on. I'll tell you, Justin, when I first got the guidelines of how we were going to curb COVID-19 and the spread, say what you will about the mask, because I didn't know, I come from construction. So, I didn't wear a mask except if I was painting or, doing something with chemicals. But setting aside what we now obviously know about the efficacy of masks, but when the guidelines are sneeze into your elbow, don't pick your nose, don't put your fingers in your eyes, and wash your hands. Why aren't we doing this stuff to begin with?
Every day.
And B, especially in restaurants, come on.
Yeah.
You're just gross, whether you're working there or whether you're a customer, if you're doing these things anyways. So I just thought that 6 foot distancing, I said, okay, 6 foot, not 7 feet, not 5 feet, but 6 feet. It just, it seemed a little wacky to me. We did it. We followed it. We were allowed to open back up, but that springtime was way different than the fall. We were essential workers, there were parades, there was, all kinds of things going on, takeout initiatives. but the whole thing fundamentally changed our business. And thankfully, we were set up. Our format limits us. Anyways, we don't have a full service restaurant. You order at a counter. We have, obviously a full service bar, but you order at a counter. So it takes, 3 people to wait on a 100-seat restaurant. So we were really limited with staff exposure as it was to begin with. And I will say, virtually none of my employees ever did wear masks. We never did have COVID here in the restaurant. There was no contact, and that's on the record, and that's in this complaint as admitted by the Department of Agriculture in their hearings. So it calls into question again all of these things. They tried to put me in jail for a law that is now unconstitutional for some crime that was never committed. It was the potential for this crime to be committed.
Yeah.
And the hyperbole was just so over the top. It was, we're still battling it, and I know that it's going to be used again, which is why we're trying to have these statutes looked at. We're talking about climate change and climate disaster, whatever the nomenclature of the week is. Yeah. But that's where some of this is heading, and trying to do away with gas stoves. Everybody joked about that, but there's legislation out there.
It really is. And you see this stuff coming every day. It's like something new, and you think, man, you can't make this stuff up. And yet here we are. I got to ask you though, because you just talked about when you said they tried to lock me up for this. I can just imagine what it was like for you. And I've talked with several folks who were very adamant and wouldn't back down during these fights. What was the toll that took on you? Because I understand the restaurant business is not a business for somebody who is has a weak stomach in the first place. I mean, you got to really, be committed, because
Yep.
It's tough work.
It is tough work. We know that going into it. The failure rate for restaurants is extremely high. You basically need to be in operation for at least 5 years to really grab a toehold. Thankfully, we're in over our 6th year here. But it did take a toll. The hardest part that I had was all the negativity and people that just didn't even want to ask questions.
Yeah.
They just wanted to assume that I was trying to kill grandma, or I was trying to kill my neighbor, or my employees or customers, or I was accused of stealing business from other restaurants. I had a GM from a restaurant here in town, a franchise restaurant here in town, and said, I just want to know how you have the balls to stay open when the rest of us couldn't. And I just said, hold on a second. I said, wouldn't. I said, you could have, because I did, but you wouldn't. And that's really the only person that ever even had any fortitude to question me on anything. But it did take a toll. And that was the hardest part was, my friends, my family was 100% supportive, thankfully. But some friends, and then the negativity through social media, I got doxxed on Thanksgiving. I had people calling the restaurant, all kinds. I've got cameras around my house now. All kinds of crazy stuff happened, but I'll tell you, not a single person ever came here into the restaurant to threaten any of us or to do anything crazy. Though we had plenty of anonymous phone calls, anonymous tips to the liquor commission, to the food tip line. But that anger and that negativity, when it first, that was when, I had somebody recently ask me, did you ever feel like quitting? And I said, no. I said, but the hardest thing that I struggled with and wanted to, if I were going to, was just before I had a conversation with a really good friend of mine. And I couldn't understand all this hate and all this anger. Wow. And I said, I thought it was this dynamic between love and hate. And he goes, no. He goes, it's love and fear. He says, hate is just this byproduct of fear. So if you can figure out what it is that these people might be afraid of, then you will get at the core of what's going on. And that was like a light bulb moment for me, and kind of understanding why people hated me. And people still hate me to this day. But again, there's this caricature of me out there, and
Right.
sometimes I do perpetuate it. Some of it is, it's social media. Let's be honest. So there is a certain lens that people do look at me through, and I understand that. But at the end of the day, when I had this conversation, and he says to me, "No, it's that anger and that hatred is just a byproduct of fear. So let's figure out what they're afraid of." And ultimately, what I came to the conclusion is that their fear was could become from a couple of things, whether it's the current environment about not what's going on, or whether they are upset because they want to do what we were doing and didn't want to or couldn't for any number of reasons, or once things started coming to light, those people still, I have not had many people apologize, though I don't require any, for anything that they have said or disowned me or any of that after all of this new information has come out and we've won in court, and they've seen exactly what it was that we were doing. I certainly understand better why people are so angry, are still angry, and ultimately it's their problem. We're still here. I'm articulating my point of view. They can always ask questions. They don't, but thankfully, good people like yourself and a lot of others are asking good questions to try and understand exactly what it was that happened, forgetting all the COVID emotional stuff, but the way that they use these laws and the potential for them to use them in the future is what has us worried the most. And we have this availability to go through and look at and set some precedent here with these statutes to look at.
I know folks are obviously supporting you. You have people that are against you as well, but the support, I'm sure, overwhelms that. You guys, if people want to go online and do some of that, obviously they can. But I know the best thing to do would be able to get there into the restaurant, try the food, and I know you've had people come from all over. I bet you've had people come from all over the state and all over the country to shake your hand and have some risk for the brisket.
It has been pretty incredible.
Yeah.
What's actually funny, the risk for the brisket is, a friend of mine came up with that when we were sitting around drinking out back one night. We had an igloo outside that we called the pigloo, and we were just having some fun. And, it got brought up in a court hearing, and one of the judges, kind of made a comment about it and said, "Oh, I see the slogan is risk it for the brisket." He goes, "A more appropriate slogan might be die for the brisket." I mean, that's the level of hyperbole that we're dealing with in front of it's supposed to be a neutral party. This judge, this jurist is supposed to be neutral, and he makes these remarks, and it's incredible how over the top they are with some of this. But the support has come from all over. I mean, we have shipped T-shirts all across the world. I'm not even kidding. Mainly to military bases. We have an incredible support amongst our veterans and our military men and women. We're always trying to find initiatives to help and support those people. And I say they are some of the most important people to listen to, our veterans right now, especially the elder generation of veteran, especially. They know exactly what the government is capable and has done in the past, with regarding wars and all of some of this crazy stuff. They know better. They've been around for a long time, and when there's crazy stuff going on, and saying January 6th is the darkest time in this country's history, that's just flat out nonsense. And I don't have an opinion either way about J6, but I mean, my point is the language is just so over the top that how do you even have a rational discussion, a starting point, with some folks that just aren't here on Earth with some of these conversations.
What is the one thing that maybe you haven't talked about yet that you wish people maybe knew or that you could share about all of this in your experience?
Oh, that is a great question. I'll tell you, it's so hard when we're talking about legal procedure. I mean, people's eyes just want to glaze over.
Yeah.
ultimately, this is a gigantic lesson in civics, and not just for me, but for everybody. I mean, you get a certain reaction when you might say the words tyranny or when you even mention the Constitution. You know, I've taken to Twitter recently. I know you know, and it's just you try and have discussions with these people, and it's like, hold on, you must not be a fan of the Constitution, because don't be upset with me. This is a judge that made these decisions. We merely asked the question, and he's siding with Michigan Supreme Court justices. So it's hard for people to say, well, I'm not a fan of the Constitution. Well, then I know exactly where you're coming from. If you're not a fan of the Michigan Constitution mirrors the federal Constitution. So I wish that more people understood how basic this case is, and that it is not so much about trying to deny COVID or be a mask hole, as I say. It's none of that. It is about the levers of government and how these executive branch agencies wield so much power. I had Christine Geiger from Studio 8 Hair Lab on my podcast a couple of weeks ago. The Department of, I'm sure you probably know, she's the one that made some comments about the TQ plus community not being, necessary. They should get a haircut somewhere else, right? I know a little bit about her case. I've seen the 2 complaints from the Department of Civil Rights. And these complaints and these orders are so ominous. They don't cite statutes, but they require you to respond within 14 days, but they don't tell you what kind of penalties could be coming if you don't respond. And it's just more of this. And if we don't stand up now and say, hold on, this is actually not allowed by the Constitution. In Christine's case, it's actually a First Amendment free expression issue, but this is an executive branch agency that is basically trying to attack her. We haven't heard much from the city of Traverse City yet. But they may come after her as well. But this is the point. Myosha and Alpena, the school board, in these 2 school mass cases that we're also adjacent with, this is what's we haven't even talked about Eagle, the environmental agencies and what they're trying to do. So this is the entire point I wish more people knew, is that I don't dislike government. I believe it should be limited. And the way it should be limited is exactly how the Constitution limits it, in the vesting articles that tell exactly what these 8 branches are supposed to do. And that's what's going to have to happen moving forward, is once this ruling comes out, Judge Hunter has precedent to stand on, his own ruling and in re certified questions, which knocked down the EPGA in October of 2020. So this should be a pretty easy thing for him to look out. I don't want to speculate. He is a very smart jurist, and not just because he ruled in my favor in my case. I had appeared before him on another matter, but he's a very fair guy and a pretty smart. I mean, he issued a federal Supreme Court brief in our case, so he knows exactly. And by court rule, it has to go to him. That's the wonderful thing. So I just wish that people knew that it was really about the basics of how laws are made and how laws are executed. And there shouldn't be one branch that is doing both of those. And that's what we're trying to point out.
Ian Murphy, if people want to support you, obviously they can come to the restaurant, the Iron Pig, but I'm sure there are other ways to do that as well. And I also want people to know, if you want to share where they can find you online and Twitter, like you just mentioned, but the podcast too.
Yeah, we're so all of our handles for the Iron Pig are at Iron Pig Smoke. We're YouTube, we're on Facebook, Twitter. We do have a locals channel. I love that you're on locals, buddy. It's a great way for independent content creators to get out there, get local support. Our Fuelcast TV podcast is fuelcasttv.com. Also on YouTube and basically anywhere that there's a streaming platform. We're there. Apple, all those, Spotify, we're out there. So have a listen. We've got, our attorney has been on before. We actually discussed some of this in some previous podcasts. Again, the podcast, a long podcast with Christine Geiger, and whether or not you agree with her or disagree with her, she has a very interesting point of view about her free speech. And, we appreciate all of the support. The restaurant has been crazy busy. 2021, by the way, was our best year on record. So it has only gotten better. And it should show everybody. And I think people like Christine are a good example. When one person stands up, it shows another person that you can and that you should show up. And it is your duty to question your government, especially when it's doing things that you disagree with. Take the proper steps. Your due process is there, and use it.
Ian Murphy, thank you for your courage to stand up and do the right thing. And of course, all the fight, it's not easy, but it sounds like it's worth it. And we appreciate you.
Thank you, Justin. I appreciate everything.
You got it, man. God bless.